So, as many of you may know, I am close with my family. That is to say, obviously, I'm close with my immediate family, my wife and my 4 kids, but I'm also close with my extended family, the family with whom I grew up. My brother lives down the street from me, my sister about 2 miles away, my parents less than a mile down the road from Tomball Bible Church, and my brother-in-law is Kevin Bowles, the executive pastor of Redeemer Church, who is hosting a live stream this morning as well. And they're in the midst of constructing their building just a few blocks from here. And we love each other very much, and we're really supportive of each other and one another's ministries. A lot of you also probably know that I have a close friendship with my cousin Hans Guger. We were born only 8 months apart, and we grew up living down the street from each other. Both of us spent the nights at each other's houses all the time growing up, and we went to the same church when we were growing up, and we were involved in the same youth group, and we went to the same college, and we served in the same college ministry together. And now he lives a couple miles from me as well and is pastoring Genesis Community Church out in Spring. But before we were at different churches, Hans and I both served together in Baton Rouge at a church called The Chapel. And for a while, we were kind of doing that as colleagues in separate ministry areas at one location. It was a multi-site church. And then we were serving together at the site pastor and the site worship leader at the other location. We both got moved into different roles in about 2012. And in that case, we were still somewhat collegial in the way that we interacted with one another, but he was definitely more like my boss in that new role than the previous roles that we'd had. And it was unique to come under the authority of someone that you grew up with. And one of the reasons for that is you tend to remember things about them from an era when they were maybe less mature than they are. And it can be difficult to separate the guy in charge of your church and your ministry and everything that you are a part of from the family member that you played Police Quest 2 with at your grandma's house until 3 in the morning. And that's the thing with family. As much as you want to separate who you are as an adult and who you were as kids, those memories are always there. And as much as that new authority exists, it's hard to leave behind the old relationship. And we are going to see a version of that this morning, though decidedly unique because we're still dealing with Jesus and his family, and of course Jesus himself is unique. So let's open our Bibles today and turn to our texts. It's going to be John chapter 7, and we'll go through verse 13. So you can follow along. I'll read the entire passage, and the words will be on the screen, but if you have an open Bible at your home, I'd encourage you to follow along there as well. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, the Jewish feast of Booth was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, "He's a good man," others said, "No, he's leading the people astray." Yet, for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. May God bless today the reading and the hearing of his holy word. So, a few things that we need to remember as we orient ourselves. The first is where we have been. We spent a long while in chapter 6. We got 2 miracles at the beginning of chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the lake in Galilee. And then we got the bread of life discourse, which Ben brought to a rousing conclusion for us on Palm Sunday 2 weeks ago. And so now we've hit chapter 7. Chapter 6 encompassed about 5 weeks for us of preaching. And so now we're in chapter 7. And in verse 1, the first thing we notice is the wonderful Johannine, that means Gospel of John uses this a lot, phrase, metatauta in Greek. We've seen this before at the beginning of chapter 5 and chapter 6. It means after this, or after these things, your translation may say. And we've seen that this, you may remember, doesn't have a definitive time frame attached to it. But the way that John is typically using it, it typically means a change in setting and a jump forward in time. And that is once again the case here. So it says, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. Well, Jesus went about in Galilee. The word in the Greek does mean to walk about, but it's paired with a location. And when it's paired with a location, as we have here, it takes on the connotation of staying there or residing there, spending more time there, with the idea of not remaining in one spot. So the idea of like staying in a region. So if we were to give this a smoother, more interpretive translation, you could say something like, after these events, Jesus spent time going about the region of Galilee. That's the proper way to understand what John's getting at here. Why? Well, because he could not go about in Judea. Why could he not go about in Judea? Well, it says, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. He was a marked man. So we remember why, of course. At the end of chapter 5, Jesus had been in Judea at the Passover. And he had healed on the Sabbath and then challenged Jewish leaders. And John 5:18 says that was the time when the Jews began to want to kill him. It says this in verse 18 of chapter 5. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So John's kind of reminding us of all the things that transpired last time in Judea. So he left, and he went to Galilee, and he fed a multitude, and he walked on water, and not long after he got there, he taught in the synagogue of Capernaum. And now, John tells us, he's sort of sojourning there. He's taking some time to be there, still moving from place to place, still moving from town to town, but staying in the region of his hometown, Nazareth, and not for just a few days, but something on the order of 6 months. How do we know 6 months? Well, we get to verse 2, which says, now the Feast of Booths was at hand. Our previous indicator of the Jewish calendar was Passover in chapter 5. So Jesus leaves Judea in chapter 5 at the conclusion of Passover and moves into the region of Galilee in chapter 6. Now, we hear in verse 2 that another Jewish holiday, the Feast of Booths, is at hand. That means we've jumped probably 6 months. Passover is typically late March, April. Feast of Booths is September, October. And now we already heard our amazing children's lesson this morning, and let me stop and just say, aren't those amazing? I'm so grateful for Danielle and Ashley and Kristen and all our volunteers in what is truly a bizarre time in our church and really life everywhere. Those videos still manage to show what a top-tier children's and nursery ministry that we have at Tumble Bible. If you haven't yet, and even if you don't have kids who directly benefit from their ministry, send those ladies some encouraging words this week. This is who they are. They're leaving it all on the field for our kids, and it's a tough job that often gets overlooked when we're able to be gathered together. And it's not new. It's not just during this strange era. It's all the time. And if you have kids and you haven't checked out the amazing Easter Jam video that posted last week, which features Ben and our amazing student ministry leaders as well, shame on you. You should go check that out. The Godbold House loved it. It is amazing. And so just brief encouragement to them. I really would ask that you just bless them this week. Tell them what an amazing job they're doing, because that's not just because of the time that we're in. That's who they are. Anyway, unpause. Back to the text. In today's video, they mentioned the Feast of Booths, also called the Feast of Tabernacles. They did a lot of the groundwork for me. I don't have to tell you what it is. You heard from them. And they showed you some pictures of the structures that they would build, these booths. Now, this is the final and greatest feast of the Israelite agricultural year, and one of the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals that would happen, where everybody would travel to Jerusalem to go to this feast. It is specifically celebrating the harvest of grapes and of olives, and really the end of the harvest season in general, as we heard. And so the Feast of Booths in Hebrew is called Sukkot, and it's still celebrated even in modern Israel. In fact, we have a couple pictures of how it tends to look now. Yeah, there's a guy. He's setting up his booth. He's still got palm fronds. Now we're a little more sophisticated. We got some plywood going on, and he's definitely standing on like a restaurant table to get that there. And there's just a busy city street kind of cleared as people are constructing the booths. And the crowds in the pictures, I couldn't get any that weren't copyrighted, so I didn't put them up. But the crowds are insane for the Feast of Booths. And so to us as Gentiles, even Gentiles who read our Bible, it seems a strange custom. But it's filled with intense meaning for Israel, as we already heard. And honestly, it's really not any stranger than cutting down a tree and putting it in your house and hanging lights on it. What it points to is a reminder of God's faithfulness in providing for Israel during the time of the Exodus. We heard that from our children's video. And when they all lived in tents and had no crops to harvest, right? That was when they were nomads. They all lived and they went from place to place, and they were living in a desert, living on manna and quail and water from rocks. So the Feast of Booths was to remind them, once they got those things, where they had come from and whom they had come from. That God was the one who was Lord of the harvest. He was the one that saw them to the land where they could finally settle and till the earth and plant the crops. But because it was a harvest festival, it took on and still has a very joyful feeling. We heard that in the video too. Josephus, the Jewish historian, called the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths, the holiest and greatest feast of the Jews. It was also a rabbinical saying, "The man who has not seen these festivities does not know what Jubilee is." And it was, we should point out, antithetical to the way other societies lived when it was originally instituted. Other societies, like the Canaanites in the region, they would build temporary shelters while they tilled and worked in the fields to sleep and eat out there so they could get up and get back to work the next morning without having to lug all their gear all the way home. And then they would work, do it all again, wash, rinse, repeat. Then when the harvest was done, they'd strike the tents and then they'd go home. They'd celebrate where the bounty was. We go fill the storehouse. We go home and we celebrate because raining season's coming, and you don't want to be in the place that doesn't have a real roof. But not in Israel. There you built the shelter after the harvest to remember the God who delivered you. In modern times, this feast is especially a favorite among kids. And I think it's because there is a universal truth that crosses all cultures. Kids love tents, and there is a sense of wonder in sleeping outdoors or even just erecting a temporary shelter. You can probably remember as a kid being like, let's build a blanket fort. And just this week, the kids and I did a backyard camp out. We have a picture of that too. There they are in our little Coleman tent. They are super excited, and yeah, there's us at night taking a camping selfie. And I wish I could say that it was in preparation to teach the sermon. I'm like, oh, we'll stay outside. But it was really just to break up the monotony of our COVID-19 reality that we're all living in. And my beautiful wife, Andrea, who hates camping, said, I don't know why you all are sleeping outside like homeless people when the house that you pay for is just 15 feet away. Her words. Andrea is a Canaanite. And Liam, Kinsley, and Ella and I are faithful Jews, just for the record. Ava was too little to camp, so she gets a pass. I love you, babe. I'm just kidding. The point is, we have to understand the context of sleeping outside when you don't need to. It was weird to other cultures, right? The booths didn't have any meaning to non-believers. They didn't understand. Why would you missed your opportunity to actually sleep out? It would have made sense to build that while you were working in the field, and you could have kept all your tools in it, stored some food, just slept out there, and then got back to work the next day. And they're like, no, we build it after we've done all the work. And we stay out there, we sleep out there, and we party out there. And everybody's like, what are you talking about? So, we give that context just to say that the Feast of the Booths is a huge deal. And we'll see how that plays out in the following verses. So look at verse 3. It says, his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. So remember, we're all in Galilee, that's north of Judea. Jesus' family lives in Galilee. His brothers are now apparently with Jesus as the feast draws near. That makes sense. These things are technically family affairs, right? And now it's here, and so that means they all need to stop everything in Galilee and head to Jerusalem as faithful Jews. And this is the first mention of Jesus' siblings in the Gospel of John. And if you know anything about Jesus' background, you know that he's the oldest. But there are other brothers that are mentioned in the other canonical Gospels, and they're all adults at this point, it stands to reason. And you are getting to the point where maybe you feel like you could give your eldest brother some advice, right? And that's what these guys are doing. They're saying, Jesus, all your disciples are in Galilee, and they're all headed to the feast. Why don't you go down there with them, and show them what you can do? And verse 4 gives more insight into their reasoning. Verse 4 says, for no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Now, they're saying, you're just bouncing around your old stomping ground. If you're really going to do this, you ought to go to the main stage, Jesus. That ain't here. That's in Jerusalem. Show them what you've got. No better time than the Feast of Booths. And it should also be said that because this is a celebratory feast, in Jesus' day, there was some messianic hope tied to the Feast of Booths, as with a lot of things. They were tethering messianic hope to pretty much anything they could. And that will come into play more in subsequent weeks, but it's good to bear it in mind now. There's some subtext there. So his brothers are sort of stepping in, right, as self-appointed campaign managers and saying, hey, you're doing this wrong, Jesus. If you're really the Messiah, now's the time. You've got to make yourself known. You've been doing this for 6 months. Everybody's ready. But then the gut punch comes in verse 5, and it's not anything that the brothers say, it's John's narration. For not even his brothers believed in him. And this is the part that should blow us away. Jesus, the God-man, holy, perfect Jesus, they're just coming up to him like, hey, buddy, we love you, even if you're having delusions of grandeur, by the way. They don't believe. They're like everyone else in Galilee. It's safe to assume that they've seen the miracles, right? They've definitely heard about them if they haven't seen them. But they are saying, if this is really on the level, love you, by the way, even if you're nuts. But if it's real, you're not doing it right. That's kind of what they're saying. First of all, how offensive is that? My brother, Zach Godbold, is a data analyst at a telecom company. He's been in the industry for 10 years. And that's like me going, hey, Zach, here's what you really need to do to upgrade this customer's wide area network hardware. I play guitar and read books, so you should definitely listen to me. So it's ridiculous. Second, once again, we're linked back to the verses in chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. They look like so many of the superficial disciples in that passage. Jesus couldn't entrust himself to them because he knew what was in their hearts. He knows what's in the hearts of man. His brothers understood that he could do miracles, but they could not perceive the significance of what they saw, and therefore did not penetrate to their hearts Jesus' real identity. He was still just their older brother, not the Son of God. And I think it is sad, but also a remarkable human part of this gospel story to me that attests to its trustworthiness. It's not that they weren't trying in their own way to be supportive of their brother. They wanted to support Jesus and his ministry. Their brains just couldn't go far enough down the road and meet Jesus where he actually was. Just like Hans and I had played computer games at my grandma's, those memories weren't edged out by him being my boss all those years later, as much as maybe they should have been in certain staff meeting situations that I won't mention. I think that there are similar things happening here. And Jesus kind of answers to their suggestion, to their unbelief in verse 6. It says, Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. And at first glance, we may wonder what Jesus really means here. It seems kind of like another one of those kind of cryptic sayings. The my time has not come part seems similar of a statement to what we already heard Jesus say to his mother at the wedding in Cana. That was chapter 2, verse 4. It says, and Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. But there's a different word there. We have hour in chapter 2, and we have time here in chapter 7. And there are different words in the Greek as well. The difference between 2:4 and now is deliberate. Unlike hora, that's the Greek word for hour, Jesus does not appear to be referring to the being lifted up, the hour of his glorification by way of the cross. Instead, he's referring to kairos, the Greek word for time here. And it's not used that way elsewhere in John's gospel. It's used to mean the proper time, the appointed time. So we're essentially getting a statement that's similar, but not carrying the same spiritual weight that it carried in chapter 2. We know this because elsewhere in John's gospel, the term hour appears again in the same context. In fact, it does so again in this very chapter. Look at verse 30. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. So John is being deliberate here. That's not static on this microphone. That's rain, everyone. And when we finally arrive at that point in the gospel, in chapter 13, what does Jesus say? What does John say about Jesus? He says in John chapter 13, verse 1, now before the feast of Passover, so again, this is later, when Jesus knew that his hour, ora, had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So, this is not that. This is more like saying, the right time, kairos, for me, has not yet come. For you, any time, kairos, is right. So now, before we go and take away any spiritual significance about what Jesus is saying, let's note, Jesus is still displaying some divine sovereignty here, but it's not related to his death. It's just related to the events that will unfold in the rest of the chapter. And it's more based around the familiar passage from Ecclesiastes 3:1, which was adapted into an excellent song by the Byrds. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. That's the kind of time that Jesus is implying. In that light, Jesus' brothers would probably not be upset to hear Jesus saying, my time has not yet come. He's saying, it's not the right time. It's not the right time is something that all of us say. And we say it when we just get a sense that not all the right pieces are in play. But his brothers would have definitely had a problem when they heard him say, for you, any time is right. It's almost as if they are being excluded from the divine sovereignty on display here. Not that God suspended his providential reign over Jesus' brothers. Of course, he didn't do that. But what they did was utterly without significance compared to the manner and timing of Jesus' arrival on the feast. And that interpretation is confirmed in the next verse. In verse 7, Jesus says, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. Jesus' brothers don't have an appointed time for the feast because they belong to the world. When they go is when they go. And of course, belonging to the world, this is the natural fallen world. So he's saying the world cannot hate you because they belong to that world. They belong to it. And the world loves its own. We see this, or the opposite of this, when Jesus is speaking to his disciples later on in John's Gospel in chapter 15, verse 19. He says, if you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, because I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. So Jesus is saying, the world loves its own. You can go to the feast. Just go. But in contrast, the world hates Jesus, not only because he doesn't belong to it, but because he testifies that what it does is evil. So Jesus' reasoning for staying is summed up in the distinction between himself and his brothers. So he says again in verse 8 and 9, you go up to the feast. I'm not going up to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come. After saying this, he remained in Galilee. Now the word fully also betrays what we'll read later, which is that Jesus is going to go to the feast, just not yet. He stays in Galilee. If the story ended there, we'd probably believe Jesus just doesn't go to the feast in Jerusalem to participate. But then we get to verse 10. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. This would seem to indicate that Jesus set off not long after them. And the reason is likely that Jesus wished to avoid being made a public show by his brothers, right? His brothers have shown up. They've said, hey, let's do this thing together. And he's like, you go on ahead. And it's because they'd already shown their unbelief through their own political and selfish ends. They wanted to rally people around Jesus. And to avoid affording any opportunity for this, Jesus leaves after them in secret. And we should remember, and Jesus himself has surely not forgotten, that in Galilee there were some that had already tried to take him by force and make him king. We saw that in verse 15 of chapter 6. So secret here probably just means he went by himself and not part of a caravan or a large company of his relatives who, according to custom, would go up together in Galilee. And since we have a little bit better picture of the significance of this feast now, it's easier to understand how large those caravans or gatherings of fellow travelers coming out of towns might have actually been. It would have been really easy to stir everybody up and turn this into a big triumphal procession. And we can easily see how big these crowds might have been from the account of Jesus not being missed by Mary and Joseph when he was a boy at the temple, when he was there at age 12. This is from Luke chapter 2, verses 43 and 44. It says, "And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances." So Jesus' parents lost Jesus in the crowd of relatives and acquaintances and didn't notice for a whole day that he wasn't in the caravan. And again, you heard, I come from a pretty big family. Once you throw in all the extended relatives and all the kids and cousins and stuff, when we're all at our camp in Livingston, it can be a little like that with kids. They all kind of scatter, but you assume they're all not alone. They're all playing somewhere. And you start kind of going, hey, where's Liam? I haven't seen Liam in a while. And you kind of start asking aunts and uncles and relatives and older cousins, hey, have you guys seen Liam? And you're like, oh, he's in the sandbox. Or he's, you find him, right? That's kind of where they were there. But no, he was like, no, I didn't even leave. I stayed at the temple. So the idea is these caravans are huge. They're big family affairs. Jesus not going with his family is because he doesn't trust them to help him do the will of the Father, which Jesus must do. So he waits for the appointed time, and then he departs alone. That's another one of those moments for me in the gospel that we really do see kind of the hypostatic union at play. Jesus is fully God and fully man. He's got human relatives that he has to deal with, just like all of us. And he's like, you guys go ahead. I'll go later. And it's because he can't trust them not to do what their sinful inclination is to do. So he goes, I'm not going to entrust myself to you. Just like he says in chapter 2. Jesus can't entrust himself to them. So he waits, and then he goes. And Jesus' brothers aren't wrong. People are looking for Jesus at this feast. That's what we see. Folks have heard about what he's doing in Galilee, and they are hoping for a Hosanna in the highest type moment that we heard about 2 weeks ago, Palm Sunday. Hoping that Jesus comes at the time of the harvest to begin a messianic season of plenty. Word is out about Jesus. He's at a relatively late stage in his 3-year ministry already, and people are now beginning to expect some sort of showing from him, like he did at the pool of Bethesda in chapter 5, the last feast that John recounted. So then we get to verse 12. There was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, he's a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. And then verse 13, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly around the Jewish leaders. No one spoke openly of him. So, the rumor mill's churning. That's the muttering. They're talking amongst themselves in hushed tones and debating about what he is, or who he is, and what his intentions are. But as verse 13 says, they're afraid to speak openly. There's Jewish leaders around, and they know how the Jewish leaders feel about him. But what they are muttering generally falls into two camps, according to John. First camp, some say he's a good man. The second camp, others say he's leading people astray. So group one is seemingly a lot like Jesus' brothers. I love you, bro. I may not agree with you about all this Son of God stuff, but I think you're a good man. Jesus already has an answer for any who would call him a good man or a good teacher. It is the same one he gave the rich young ruler in Mark 10:18. Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Group two, they're more opposed to Jesus. They feel like he's a blasphemer, that he is leading people away from God. You know who's not muttering anything? The believers, because there aren't any. No one's muttering, he's the Son of God. That's not being talked about. Even though at this point, Jesus has gone to great lengths to show people this truth, to teach about this. It's not the rumblings that we hear. Instead, what we hear is the same unbelief that we've heard all throughout this gospel. Just two shades of unbelief, right? Favorable and unfavorable, but both missing the truth. So by way of application this morning, I have stated that these are both unbelief. We have essentially two groups. I'd lump Jesus' family in with the favorable group. They're saying he's a good man. And then there's those muttering in the crowd that say Jesus is leading people astray. He's a blasphemer. So the question I want to pose this morning is this: is there a common root underpinning these two types of unbelief? Before I try and answer that question, let me tell you why this matters. The short answer is that believing on Jesus is how we receive eternal life. John tells us in John 20, verse 31, why he wrote this book. It says, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Believing is how you receive eternal life. And we know he means eternal life because back in chapter 3, John says this: "Whoever believes in the Son of God has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him." John Piper said it this way. He said, "Apart from Jesus, we are all under God's wrath, because we all have treated God with contempt by giving him so little of our attention and affection and obedience." So, to answer the question, let's look at each group more closely. Let's treat the easy group first. Let's look at the group in the crowd who spoke unfavorably about Jesus, because we can easily see their unbelief. They're the mockers. They're the scoffers. Those that believe he's leading people astray. As one commentator said, they saw in Jesus a mere demagogue, a man to be shunned, a false prophet, one who was interested in getting the mob on his side, ingratiating himself with the multitudes for selfish purposes. Now, obviously, these people didn't believe. They weren't just unfavorable, they were unimpressed. For the brothers, they're skeptical of Jesus' identity. They're skeptical of Jesus' message, but they're not skeptical of his miracles. They're irrefutable. The only difference is that they react favorably toward them. And this is also true for at least a portion of the crowd, right? Unlike the unimpressed in the crowd, some of them are saying he is a good man. And when they say good, they mean that he's moral, that he's upright. The things that he's doing from a good place. This is clearly true, of course. Jesus is good. He is morally upright. But then they say that he's a good man. And in a sense, that's right too, of course. He is a good man. But that's not all he is. He's also God. This group is perhaps, therefore, more vexing, more frustrating. At least you know where you stand with the mockers and the scoffers. They're uninterested. They're unimpressed. They're unbelievers, after all. But at least they're logically consistent. They don't believe in him, and they won't even call him good because they recognize what his claims truly mean. But for the second group, and this includes Jesus' own brothers, they're not being consistent. Jesus can't just be a good man. He can't. Even if a good man could do the things that Jesus could do, a good man can't make the claims that Jesus has already made countless times in the Gospel of John, because he's not claiming to be just a man. He's claiming to be God. That's inconvenient for someone who finds Jesus' ministry attractive, finds his teachings admirable. And that was true in the time of Christ, and it's definitely true now. Very few people, even in the most secular of societies, will fully dismiss Jesus' teachings on forgiveness or his compassion for the poor. But all the other stuff about being God, obviously, that can't be right, they would say. But it's what Jesus says about himself. He is either telling the truth or lying, or he's an insane person. This line of reasoning was popularized by C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I am ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend. Consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God." This is sometimes referred to as the liar, lunatic, or Lord apologetic, or the great trilemma. And there is a lot more that we could say about it. There are ways that you can go down that rabbit hole with it and go, oh, what about this? What if he's more of a legend and all? I understand. We don't have time to go into all of that, but there's great reading material out there. William Lane Craig has some that kind of shows you all of the ways that the legend thing doesn't really work, because Jews wouldn't invent a sacrilegious legend about God. That's not how that works. But the brass tacks of it is right on the money this morning. Even Jesus' brothers wanted to exist in this mushy middle about him. Why? Well, it's the same reason for unbelief that's found in the first group. It is the root of unbelief. They're selfish. The common root of unbelief is selfishness. The mockers and the scoffers, the uninterested unbelievers, they're okay with the status quo. They're aware that everything that Jesus is saying and doing threatens to completely upend it. We'll see in subsequent weeks just how much that's true. But what they want is nothing that Jesus has to offer. They want nothing to change. Jesus is a wrench in their machine. The selfishness of Jesus' brothers and those in the crowd who would call him good is also easy to spot. We've already seen it throughout John. They're enthralled by Jesus' miracles, but they don't want to receive his teaching about himself. For his brothers, at least, there's some understandable hesitance. How could their older brother that they played with in the fields be God? That's at least a reasonable question in a fallen world to ask. It's easy for our brains to understand that. But for everyone else, it's more of the same. They'll crowd around him for healings. They'll listen to his moral lessons and hope to get fed by multiplication of food that's miraculous. But they don't want what he's actually offering. Both the crowds and Jesus' own brothers don't want the real Jesus. Both those that see him favorably and unfavorably all want the same thing. They want a smaller version of Jesus that they can understand, one that they can fit into their existing paradigms, their existing worldviews. So, for believers this morning, if you're watching this, if I can tell you anything, it's to remember these things. Next time you encounter a friend or a neighbor or a coworker who has a favorable view toward Christianity or Jesus or mentions church or growing up in church or going to church on occasion, do not assume that they believe in the real Jesus. Plenty of people in Jesus' day loved him. Plenty of people in Jesus' day were interested in the things that he had to say. But go deeper with your neighbors, with your colleagues, with your family members. Ask them questions. You may find that they need to hear the gospel from you. And if you are, by some happenstance, someone who is a Christian and you're watching this, I pray that you would see Jesus as he really is. He can't just be a wonder worker or a good teacher and make the claims that he made about himself. And as we heard from John last week, good teachers don't rise from the dead. This is why John wrote his gospel, that you might hear the truth about Jesus and believe it. It's not too late. It wasn't for Jesus' brothers either. They remained skeptics until after he rose from the dead. At that point, there was no reason to deny it anymore. One of Jesus' brothers, James, would show up in the book of Acts as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He would write the book in the New Testament that bears his name that we read from this morning, encouraging his Christian brothers toward joy even in the midst of trial. So also would Jesus' brother Jude write to tell Christian brothers to remain steadfast and contend for the faith. It's a complete transformation, the same that is also available to you. So I pray that you would see him as he really is this morning. The Word of God made flesh, the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth, that you may be granted grace upon grace according to his fullness, that you would believe in him and have life. Let's pray.